Welcome everybody. This video is going to continue our series about concept empiricism by looking at what kind of story we can really tell about how you might start from experience and build up to the complex and huge variety of concepts that we're able to think about in our mind. In the video, we're going to start out by looking at what I'm going to call Locke's simplicity argument in favor of concept empiricism. And this is going to be used to frame the discussion later on, where we look at the mental operations that we can perform that can help the empiricist explain the processes by which we move from experience to the various ideas we have in our mind. And then we'll use those operations and apply them to specific examples, and then this will also include a discussion of potential worries. The argument I want to start out with, Locke says it would be sufficient to convince unprejudiced readers of the falseness of this supposition if I should show how men may attain all the knowledge they have without the help of any innate impressions, and may arrive at certainty without any such original notions or principles. He says, for I imagine anyone will easily grant that it would be impertinent to suppose the ideas of colors innate in a creature to whom God has given sight and a power to receive them by the eyes from external objects. And no less unreasonable would it be to attribute several truths to the impression of nature and innate characters, when we may observe faculties fit to attain as easy and certain knowledge of them as if they were originally imprinted on the mind. So the argument here is essentially appealing to what's known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor says that when we have a phenomenon we're trying to explain, imagine we have two explanations. If one of them is simpler than the other, then other things being equal, the simpler explanation is more likely to be true. And so the idea here is the observation we're trying to explain is that human beings have several ideas and we have a lot of knowledge. Well, where do those ideas, where do those concepts, where does that knowledge come from? That's what we need to explain, how they get into our mind. Now, his claim is that, well, it's possible, one possible explanation is that all of those ideas in our mind, all that knowledge in our mind, ultimately comes from experience. And he says, well, if experience can account for all of those, well, then it's unnecessary to posit any innate ideas or knowledge. And he says we shouldn't posit any hypothesis beyond what's necessary for explaining the observed phenomena. So simpler theories are to be preferred. And the claim here is that the hypothesis that we have these faculties for creating experiences, and then we're able to turn those experiences into all of the ideas and knowledge in our mind, that is a simpler hypothesis than the hypothesis that we have these experiential faculties to create ideas, plus we have innate ideas and innate knowledge. That overcomplicates the picture of the human mind, and so if the hypothesis that our ideas come from experience and the operations of the mind on those experiences, we ought to prefer that simpler explanation if it's equally good. Which, according to premise 2, he says we are able to do that. And so probably our ideas and knowledge are acquired via experience. But the persuasiveness of this argument is going to depend critically on that second premise. Is it actually possible to give an explanation for how we start with our experiences and use those to acquire all of the ideas that we find in our mind, all of the knowledge that we find in our mind? If there's any ideas or knowledge in our mind that are left out that cannot be explained in that way, well, then this argument doesn't work. So in this video, we're going to take a more detailed look at Locke and Hume's attempt to explain how you start with experience and are able to get ideas into the mind. So firstly, one thing that's going to be important is Locke is going to distinguish between two kinds of experience that can be used to acquire our ideas and knowledge. So Locke distinguishes between the experiences produced by sensation and the experiences produced by reflection. So sensation is a kind of outer sense. We have these sensory organs that respond to external objects and create sensory experiences of those objects. But we also have reflective experiences. This here is an experience or sense that is directed not towards the outside world, but towards the internal world, towards the operations of our own mind. So I can reason, I can make choices, and the claim here is that in my mind I can metaphorically turn my eye inward and pay attention to and experience the things going on in my own mind. The reasoning, the thinking, the willing, the desiring, the emotions, the making choices. And so those experiences can give me more materials for creating ideas. Similarly, Hume believes we should make a distinction between two kinds of impressions or experiences that could then be copied to acquire ideas. So firstly, like Locke, he says there are sensations. So an example here is the experiences produced by our sensory organs. So the experiences produced by sight, visual experiences, touch, tactile experiences, hearing, auditory experiences. Reflection, these are the impressions we have that are essentially reactions or responses to other impressions or ideas. So an example here is we have this inner reflective experience of our own desires, intentions, emotions, passions, and sentiments. The idea is an emotion, like fear, is a reaction to other ideas or impressions in our mind. So when we think about the idea of a bear, or when we have the impression of a bear, our mind reacts to that impression, reacts to that idea by feeling fear. That reaction of fear that our mind has is itself an impression, an experience we have. So all of this broadens the amount of experiences that the empiricist has to draw on, and essentially it gives them metaphorically more colors to paint with as they try to create our ideas. Now, it's also important to draw a distinction not just between sensory experiences and reflective experiences, but also between simple ideas and complex ideas. Remember that simple ideas are ideas that cannot be decomposed into any smaller ideas, and these are received directly from our experience or impressions of sensation and reflection. And our mind is largely passive when we acquire these simple ideas. These ideas almost sort of happen to us. We're not in control of gaining these ideas. So an example here is I look at a red rose, I have the impression of a red rose, and I get the idea of a particular shade of red. Similarly, my idea of a particular square shape would be a simple idea. Now, it's also really important to note that our simple ideas pick out particular. They are copies of very specific particular impressions. So there's a difference between the idea of this particular shade of green and my idea of green generically. So my idea of mint green is a simple idea, but my idea of green, where that includes mint green, forest green, turquoise, it includes all of those ideas, well, that generic idea is not simple because it's composed out of those smaller ideas. And that brings us to complex ideas. These are ideas that are composed or built out of simpler ideas. They have other ideas as parts. And here, our minds are active in the production of these. We are involved in creating these. We have some control over creating these ideas. The claim is there's certain natural powers or faculties of the mind that we have that allows us to take the simple ideas and use those materials to build complex ideas. Well, Locke distinguishes between the following abilities that he thinks the mind has. Firstly, he says we have this natural ability to combine ideas. An example here would be the complex idea of a green triangle. I take my simple idea of green, my simple idea of triangle, combine them together to get the complex idea of a green triangle. Or take my ideas of being unmarried, being an adult, and being male. I combine or unite those ideas into a single idea, and that creates the complex idea of a bachelor. We also have this process of being able to compare ideas in our mind to create new ones. So an example here would be taking the idea of one square, putting it together with the idea of another square in your mind without combining them, and comparing their size, and thereby creating the idea of something being bigger than or smaller than another thing. He also thinks we have this process of abstraction. So what does that mean? Consider an example. I might take the idea of several different triangles, different sizes, different shapes, different angles, put them all before my mind next to each other, all right, and then remove the particularities from each individual one. So take away the particular length, take away the particular size, take away the particular angle, until I arrive at an idea of what all these triangles have in common. Instead of thinking about what's specific to each triangle, thinking about what's common to all triangles. This would be the generic idea of triangularity, where it covers every triangle that I might encounter in my experience. That's the generic idea. Now, this abstraction process is really important because for the empiricist, we start with ideas and knowledge of particulars and move to the general cases. This is very different than the order in which the rationalist is going to think these things take place. they're going to think that we start with these general ideas and use them to get ideas of particular things. Or we start with this knowledge of general principles and use that to gain knowledge of specific particular things. So the order is reversed. The empiricist thinks we start with the particular and move to the general, whereas the rationalist is often going to think we need to start with the general and use that to gain knowledge or ideas of the particular. So now that we have a better understanding of the materials that the empiricist is working with to try to explain how our ideas get in our mind, let's talk about some potentially problematic examples. Ideas we have in our mind that it's not initially clear how they would get there from experience, and then we can look at how the empiricist can try to give an explanation. So the first one here is just obvious. You might say, look, we have ideas of things that we've never actually experienced in the world. I've never encountered a unicorn in sensation, but I have the idea of a unicorn. Now this I think is actually pretty straightforward. As Locke says, when the mind has once gotten these simple ideas, so once we have those, it's not confined barely to observation and what offers itself from without. So the claim here is there's a limit to the simple ideas we can get. They can only come from things that we have actually had first-hand experience with. But once we start building ideas into complex ideas by these operations of the mind, we can put together those ideas of things we have experienced to make new complex ones which we haven't experienced in that combination. Hume gives an example here. He says, when we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were formerly acquainted. So I've never experienced a golden mountain. But the claim here is complex ideas do not need to match a specific impression we've had, because they're not direct copies. But the empiricist can still explain how we acquire those from experience by saying how we get the parts from copying prior impressions we've had. I am formerly acquainted with a mountain, and thereby get the idea of a mountain. I'm formerly acquainted with the experience of gold, and I get the idea of gold. And now through the operation of the mind, I take these ideas that I got from experience and I combine them into a new one, the golden mountain. But there's some other ideas in our mind that are a bit worrisome for the empiricist. So is the process of abstraction that Locke describes, is it actually sufficient to explain how we acquire the content that makes up our generic ideas? So my idea of a specific triangle does seem to be similar to a copy of a previous sensation, as Hume says. When I imagine a triangle, I understand this claim that it seems like a faint copy of a previous triangle that I might have seen. It seems very similar to actually seeing a triangle, just not quite as vivid. And so I can get like this image before my mind almost. But can I really get the generic idea of triangularity by just removing my ideas of specific angles and side lengths from my idea of particular triangles? If those ideas of particulars are images in my mind, well, when you take away the angle, when you take away the length of a side from the image, it's not clear that there's really anything left over. It's just empty space at that point. I mean, so can you think of a triangle, an image of a triangle that doesn't have any particular length of sides or any particular size of angles? So it looks like the generic idea can't just be an image in my mind, like maybe the idea of a particular triangle would be. And so if this general idea of triangularity isn't akin to an image, then it isn't clear what sensory content would be included in that general idea. It isn't clear that I could start with just images of particular triangles to create this idea that is not itself an image. I mean, and now you might think back to Descartes' wax example. He says we have this idea of physical bodies, this generic idea of physical bodies as a purely extended substance. So he says the idea of the wax, there's this generic idea where that wax involves the possibility of infinitely many shapes and colors. It's not just a particular shape, a particular color, because you can change its shape, you can change its color, you can change its size, you can change its smell, and it's still the same physical body. So according to Descartes, we have to have this general idea of physical substance before we can have the idea of the wax, because we need to have this idea of the wax as something that can take infinitely many shapes and sizes and colors. And I can't picture all those shapes, size, and colors, even in my imagination. And so the idea seems to involve more than is just included in that sensory image, for instance. A similar worry is, can that process of abstraction really explain how we acquire abstract ideas about philosophy, like the idea of justice and substance and God. These ideas are much more abstract, much more removed from experience than even the idea of triangularity. I mean, a unicorn, that's very closely connected to experience because I have the experience of this, like I can see shapes, I can see colors, and I can just combine those in different ways to get the shape and colors of a unicorn. But the ideas of justice, substance, and God, these are much more far removed from experience, and so there has to be a much more complicated story going from experience to these much more abstract concepts. Is the process of abstraction really enough to get us there? Well, let's look at some examples. So Locke considers the idea of a substance, this philosophical idea of a physical substance or a mental substance, like a mind or a body. And here, Locke thinks the process of abstraction is enough. He says, I experience various particular physical bodies with their colors, shapes, and sizes. So I see my desk. I see me. I see that house out my window. I see a chair. I see a laptop. I get the ideas of my children. I have all these ideas. They are particular ideas with particular colors, shapes, and sizes. But then when I have those, I can abstract away from their particular shapes and sizes and get to this underlying thing, this substance that has those features. I can get to the idea of the physical body of Sam that has the brown hair, that has this shape, that has this size, that has brown eyes. The substance is the thing behind those features holding them together. I get to that idea by abstracting from those features. And similar remarks would apply to my idea of a mental substance. So I have the idea of my mind in terms of like the beliefs, the desires, the experiences, but then I abstract away from the particular beliefs, the particular experiences, the particular thoughts I have until I get to the thing behind the thoughts, the container that holds the thoughts and beliefs together, and now I have the idea of the substance as the container there. Hume does think, though, that we do have an idea of God, but he says we can get this from experience. This idea of God is just an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being. That idea arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom. So basically, we experience the operations of our own mind to get ideas of knowledge and wisdom and goodness and power, and then we just take that idea of power in our own mind, that idea of knowledge in our own mind, we add more knowledge, add more power, without limit until we get the idea of an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being. So we can appeal to the experiences of our own mind to get these simple ideas and then build them into this idea of this complex idea of God. Now, you should think, what would Descartes say about this? He is obviously skeptical that we have the ability to create the idea of God in this way. So think back to his argument from the third meditation for God's existence and try to think what he would say in response to Hume here. What about these abstract concepts about morality, like virtue or justice? Now, Hume says we do have these ideas, but they're not quite what a lot of philosophers think of. Moral concepts for Hume, he says, are not about some external eternal laws that serve as an objective source of morality. You can't see goodness, you can't hear goodness, you can't feel goodness with your hands. And so the idea, as he says, cannot come from any sensory impressions of the outer world. So where should we look for where we get this idea? He says, instead we should look inward instead of outward. Our moral concepts for Hume are actually about the sentiments we feel in response to various ideas or impressions. So his story is going to be like we see various actions, or we think about those actions like stealing and killing in our mind, and then our mind reacts to those ideas or impressions of that behavior, and it feels disapproval. And then our mind creates a copy of that impression of disapproval, and then we use that idea to create this idea of moral wrongness. And similar remarks would apply to how Hume thinks that we acquire other moral concepts. Now, you're going to have to think, is that really a good explanation? Does that really capture everything we think is in the idea of these moral concepts or not? Locke and Hume, when they introduce their concept empiricism, they actually tell their reader what they would have to do to prove them wrong. Locke says, I'd have anyone try to fancy any taste which had never affected his palate, or frame the idea of a scent he had never smelt. So he says, look, come up with a simple idea, one that doesn't have parts, not a complex one, that did not come directly from an experience he had. He says, if you do this, I'll conclude that a blind man has ideas of colors and a deaf man true distinct notions of sounds. He'll admit that, look, some ideas might just be innate. But he doesn't think you're going to be able to do this. Similarly, Hume says, Those who would assert that this position is not universally true, nor without exception, have only one, and not an easy method of refuting it, by producing that idea which in their opinion is not derived from this source. It will then be incumbent on us, if we would maintain our doctrine, to produce the impression or lively perception which corresponds to it. So the claim here is, look, go find me an idea that you think cannot be explained by appealing to our experience, and then the burden will be on me to show how I can get that idea from experience. And if I can't, well, then you win. You've shown that concept empiricism is false. Just give me one. But this is where things get weird, because Hume immediately after this gives what he himself thinks is a counterexample to this claim that ideas would always have to come from copies of previous impressions. It's what's called the missing shade of blue. In order to understand this, you need to recognize an idea of a specific shade of color is distinct from the idea of any other shade. So my idea of sky blue is a distinct idea, is different from my idea of navy blue. And an idea of a specific shade of color is a simple idea. It's not an idea composed of smaller parts. The idea of navy blue is uniform in appearance in my mind. And so, on Hume's view, it would have to be a direct copy of a past impression that we have previously had. But now, Hume says, imagine a person who has experienced every single shade of color, except for one specific shade of blue, is missing from their experience, from their impressions. They have experience with the shade of blue that is exactly one shade lighter than the missing shade. And they have the experience with the shade of blue that is exactly one shade darker than the missing shade. Hume then asks, would that person be able to gain the idea of the missing shade, the one between those two, that they've never had an experience or impression of? And Hume strangely says yes. He seems to think like they could look through the ideas of the different shades of blue, and then when they get to the missing shade, they notice that there's a gap, that there's a bigger jump from that lighter to darker shade, and they thereby be able to fill in the gap almost and come to this idea of that missing shade. But Hume also believes that that would have to be a simple idea. It can't be composed out of those two bordering colors because it's a distinct shade, uniform in appearance. It isn't like a unicorn where you take the horse shape and the horn shape and put them together. If I just put together the lighter shade and the darker shade, I just have like a square with one half lighter and one half darker. I don't get this simple idea. All right, so one thing you have to think about is Hume right here? Would someone be able to get that idea of the missing shade? If you think he's wrong about that, well then there's no counterexample to it. But if he's right, that someone would be able to get that idea of the missing shade, well now it seems like Hume needs to give a response if he's going to hold on to his copy principle, and he's going to use that for a methodology for investigating philosophical ideas and concepts. But Hume's response, he just says, look, yeah, it's an exception. This is a case where someone has an idea that's not a copy of a past impression. But he says, it doesn't really matter though, it's unimportant. It's an isolated example. It's so rare, we could just go on as if the copy principle is true. This is just the exception that proves the general rule. And so since the copy principle is pretty much always going to be true except for this maybe one very rare case, we can go on using that as our way to analyze philosophical ideas and knowledge. So you should think, is that really an adequate response? And if you think it's not, well, could you say anything else in response to this supposed counterexample? So that's all for this video. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.